On the northeastern edge of the village my mother grew up in, there's an old thatched cottage that lies by the side of the River Froom. Despite its quaint appearance, it was once the house of the parish executioner, and so it has, for time immemorial, been known to all that reside there as Hangman's Cottage. Alongside it runs a path that, when followed, will lead you over an old cast iron bridge into the water meadows that lie beyond. Now, they might not sound like it, but water meadows are fearsome, dangerous places, especially at night. Although the streams and ponds that define them may look predictable and placid, especially from a distance, you can never be quite sure where the edge of them lies, or exactly how deep they go. More than that, they are lined not by hard rock or packed earth, but by a deep sucking clay that can easily grasp a misplaced limb with a force no amount of struggling can release. Then, of course, there's the other things. The things that the older folk only talk about in hushed whispers, and the incomers from the cities sneer at. The things that live at the bottom of those pools, and tempt small children to enter. When my mother was much younger than I am now, there was a woman who lived in the village that everyone knew as old Granny Collins. She was one of those women who was already old when even the eldest of the villagers were small children, and as a result, there were things she knew. Things that the modern world had forgotten, but she had not. She knew about the things in those meadows, and she knew how to keep the little ones safe. So, for as long as anyone had known, there would come a day when old Granny Collins would knock at your door and take your child for a walk through the meadows. She'd turn up, wrapped in an old woolen shawl, carrying a wicker basket covered with a red cloth. Then she'd smile a sweet, friendly smile and lead him down the road. She came from my mother on a bright, sunny, late spring day, one of those days that still has a bracing chill in the air and an undefinable freshness about it. As they walked through the village, my mother took hold of the older woman's hand and told her all of the things they'd been learning at the small village school. Old as she was, Granny Collins had never had the chance to go to school herself, so it made her especially happy to hear the girls speak of their education. Soon enough, though, they reached the aforementioned cottage, and not long after that walked over the cast iron bridge. Then, in short order, they found themselves standing at the edge of a deep, expansive pool, just by the entrance of one of the larger water meadows. Upon reaching the edge of the pool, old Granny Collins took hold of my mother's waist in a vice-like grip, and told her to look down, deep into it. Tentatively, my mother leaned over and stared intently. It took a while for her eyes to adjust to the murk under its surface, but as they did, she started to see something sparkle in the depths. She wasn't sure exactly what it was, but she was convinced it must be made of gold or silver, and was sure it was hers by rights. So she begged the older woman to release her and let her retrieve it. In response, Granny Collins held her tighter still, then turned to her with a face of granite and instructed her to take hold of the basket, while keeping her eyes fixed on the pool. Perplexed but obedient, she took hold of its handle, and then watched in stunned silence as Granny Collins drew back the red cloth to reveal a tiny, shivering rabbit, no more than a few days old. More confused than before, she watched in horror as the kindly old woman seized the creature and callously threw it into the pool right where she had seen her sparkly treasure. Distraught and disgusted, my mother tried her best to wrestle away from the old woman's grasp, hoping she might save the poor thing. But as she reached out towards the pool in desperation, she saw it. It wasn't a face exactly, more a swirling mass of water trying to impersonate the likeness of a face. A formless apparition using the eddies, currents and shadows of the pool to form a facsimile of a semblance that resembled a face. Nevertheless, it had eyes. Eyes that began to bore deep into my mother's soul, and beneath those eyes, a mouth. Not a human mouth exactly, more of a gaping hole that had been wrenched and torn out for the sole purpose of housing the vile tongue that now darted out and wrapped itself around the animal that had been sacrificed. Held there, suspended halfway between the pool's surface and its muddy floor, it took its last few desperate breaths before it was immediately released and left to float up, lifeless and cold. At that moment, my mother felt the dry crepe-like skin of Granny Collins' hand wipe the torrents of tears away from her reddened, grief-stricken cheeks. Do you understand now, maid? Why you must never come down here by yourself and stay far away from the meadows at night? My mother wordlessly nodded her assent and then asked in a wrenching, guttural voice, "What was that thing?" "No one rightly knows," Granny Collins replied. "My old grandma used to call them drowners, and at one time they'd take 2 or 3 of you little uns a year. That was till we started taking you lot on these walks. Don't you be afeard, though. They can't leave the pools, so all you need do is stay away and you'll be safe as houses. All right, maid?" Granny Collins then took her by the hand and led her back through the village, leaving her safe at home. Eventually my mother grew up and left the village behind, but she never forgot the lesson she learned that day, and she made sure we didn't either. So, if you do ever find yourself down in the West Country, enjoying a picnic or walking your dog around the water meadows, remember the lesson old Granny Collins spent years teaching those village children, and make sure you don't get too close to the water.